Have you ever felt a chill in a sunlit room? Have you ever heard a whisper when no one was near? What if those feelings, those sounds, were not just your imagination, but echoes from a time long past, specifically from medieval convents, places of prayer and silence where shadows sometimes held more than just darkness? Get ready to explore 10 accounts from the deepest corners of the medieval era, from the 11th to the 15th century, where the veil between worlds seemed impossibly thin. Number 10. The Whispers of Wetterau Abbey. In the heart of the Wetterau region, within the formidable stone walls of the Wetterau Abbey, a Benedictine convent founded in the 12th century, a subtle disquiet began to settle over the sisters in the year of our Lord 1312. This convent, known for its strict adherence to the rule of Saint Benedict and its impressive scriptorium, was usually a place of profound peace and industry. However, a series of increasingly unsettling incidents began to erode that tranquility, starting with whispers that seemed to have no source. Sister Beatrice, a novice, recently arrived from a noble family in Mainz, was the first to report them. She was a diligent and devout young woman, known for her steady nerves and practical nature. One evening, as she knelt in her cell reciting her vespers, she distinctly heard her name called, a soft, reedy voice that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the wall beside her cot. She paused, listening intently, but there was no sound, save for the distant tolling of the bell for Compline. She dismissed it as fatigue, a trick of the mind, yet the occurrences continued soon. Other sisters began to speak of similar experiences. Sister Agatha, the convent's chief scribe, a woman of advanced age and deep spiritual discipline, found herself frequently distracted in the scriptorium. She recounted to Abbess Hildegard that she would hear faint murmurings, like several voices speaking at once, just outside the heavy oak door of the room. When she would open the door, expecting to find a group of novices loitering, the corridor would be entirely empty, save for the faint glow of the oil lamp hanging on the far wall. The sounds were never clear enough to distinguish words, merely a low, sibilant hum that seemed to float through the air, often accompanied by a sudden drop in temperature. The whispers escalated from indistinct murmurs to more precise, though still unintelligible, articulations. They seemed to follow the sisters, particularly those who were alone in the more secluded parts of the convent, the infirmary, the storage cellars, or the long, echoing cloisters during their quiet contemplation walks. Sister Isolde, a young nun responsible for tending the convent gardens, spoke of hearing what sounded like a mournful wail emanating from the depths of the well, a sound so desolate it chilled her to the bone, despite the bright spring sunshine. When she drew water, the bucket would often come up with an unnaturally cold film on its surface. Convent's daily rhythm, so precisely regulated by bells and prayers, began to show the strain of this unseen presence. Nuns grew hesitant to venture into certain areas alone. During the night office, matins, held in the pre-dawn hours, the whispers would sometimes become audible within the chapel itself. They were never loud enough to disrupt the chanting, but they were present, a faint, persistent hum beneath the sacred words. Sister Cecilia, known for her sharp hearing, claimed to hear them most clearly near the altar, specifically around the reliquary containing a bone fragment of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary. She often observed that the small, flickering flame of the perpetual lamp near the reliquary would sometimes dim and then surge erratically during these moments. Abbess Hildegard, a woman of great wisdom and experience, initially sought rational explanations. She ordered stricter silence rules, investigated potential drafts or echoes within the stone structure, and even had the convent well inspected. All inquiries yielded nothing. The phenomena were not explained by natural causes. The whispers were not wind, nor were they the creaking of old timbers. They were voices, undeniably so, yet belonging to no living soul within the convent walls. Fear, a rare commodity in such a disciplined community, began to take root. Some novices reported seeing fleeting shadows dart across the walls in the refectory, particularly during the evening meal when the room was dimly lit by a few candles. These shadows were too quick, too amorphous, to be identified as any person. They seemed to move with a speed unnatural to human motion, often passing directly through the light of the candles without casting any discernible outline. Sister Helena, while sweeping the chapel nave one afternoon, stated that a small ornate crucifix, usually hanging securely on the wall, had swung violently back and forth without any discernible air current. She swore she heard a soft chuckle, like dry leaves rustling, immediately after the crucifix ceased its movement. The most disturbing incident occurred one moonless night in the cell of Sister Colette, an elderly nun who had served the convent for over 50 years. She awoke to find her rosary beads, which she always kept tightly clutched in her hand, had been unstrung and scattered across the cold stone floor. As she fumbled for them in the dark, she distinctly heard a child's mournful crying emanating from directly beneath her bed, a sound so close it felt as if it was in the room with her. She called out but received no answer. Crying persisted for several minutes before fading entirely. When the lantern was brought in by the night watch, Sister Colette pointed to a damp, dark stain on the floor where the sound had seemed to emanate, though the rest of the floor was dry. The whispers continued for several months, an ongoing, unsettling presence. They never resolved into clear words, never manifested into a full apparition, but their constant, pervasive nature created an environment of unease. The source remained unknown. The voices seemed to ebb and flow, sometimes receding for days, only to return with renewed vigor, always just beyond comprehension, always just out of sight. The nuns learned to live with them, but the memory of the disquieting sounds of unseen presence in the silent corridors became a part of Wetterau Abbey's oral history, passed down from one generation of sisters to the next. Chronicle of the Convent, specifically the volume known as the Annals Monasterii Wetterauviensis, meticulously maintained by the successive chief scribes, recorded these events under the entry for the year 1312, noting the perturbationes auditae et invisibiles, or audible and invisible disturbances that afflicted the community. The account makes no attempt to explain the origin of these whispers, only to record their persistent nature and the unsettling effect they had upon the devout sisters of Wetterau. Number 9. The Bell of Bitterroot. The Abbey of St. Helena of Bitterroot, nestled deep within a secluded valley in the French Pyrenees, was an ancient Cistercian foundation, its heavy stone walls rising from the earth like a natural extension of the rugged landscape. Established in the late 11th century, the convent was known for its ascetic discipline and its impressive collection of religious artifacts, chief among them a massive bronze bell cast in the early 12th century named La Voix de la Sainte, the voice of the saint. This bell, usually rung only on major feast days or to signal a death, began to ring on its own accord in the winter of 1421. The first incident occurred during a particularly harsh blizzard. The snow had piled high against the convent walls, isolating the sisters from the outside world. Sister Genevieve, the portress responsible for the convent gates and the small bell tower attached to the entrance, was the first to report it. She had retired to her cell after locking the heavy main doors for the night. Around midnight, the deep, sonorous toll of La Voix de la Sainte resonated through the frozen air, shaking the very foundations of the old stone building. It was a single, deliberate stroke, clear and undeniable. Sister Genevieve, her heart pounding, immediately assumed there was an intruder or a dire emergency. She grabbed her lamp and made her way through the dark, cold corridors to the bell tower. Tower was an enclosed structure, accessible only through a heavy wooden door, secured with a complex iron lock. When Sister Genevieve arrived, she found the door still locked, the key hanging exactly where she had left it on a peg beside the door. Inside, the heavy bell rope hung still, suspended from the massive bell above. There was no sign of disturbance, no open window, no hidden entrance. Yet, the echoing thrum of the bell still vibrated in the air. She checked the mechanism. Everything was in order, the clapper resting firmly against the side of the bell. No one could have entered or left without passing through the locked door. Abbess Clotilde, a stern and pragmatic woman, initially attributed the incident to the extreme cold, perhaps a contraction of the metal or the rope. The bell rang again 2 nights later, precisely at the hour of matins, causing a profound disruption to the prayers. This time, Sister Monique, the sacristan, swore she felt a distinct chill pass through her as the bell tolled, a cold that seemed to emanate from the very altar itself. She looked up to see the candle flames near the crucifix flicker violently, almost extinguishing, then return to their steady burn. The occurrences became more frequent. The bell would toll, usually a single resounding stroke, at random times throughout the day and night. Sometimes it was during prayer, sometimes during work, sometimes in the deepest hours of slumber. It always occurred when no one was in the bell tower, and the tower door was always found locked. The sisters took turns standing watch near the bell tower, even going so far as to inspect the roof for any signs of natural interference. They found nothing. The snow remained undisturbed on the roof. The sound of the bell began to carry an unnerving quality. It was always la voix de la sainte, unmistakable in its depth and resonance, but it carried an undertone of sorrow, a lingering echo that seemed to cling to the air long after the sound itself had faded. Sister Odette, who suffered from a chronic cough, claimed that every time the bell rang her cough would worsen, and she would feel an inexplicable pressure in her chest, as if a great weight was pressing down on her. The abbess, growing increasingly troubled, consulted with Father Antoine, a local priest from the nearby village who occasionally heard confessions at the convent. Father Antoine, a man of simple faith, was initially skeptical. He spent a night within the convent walls, sleeping in the guest quarters near the bell tower. At precisely 2 a.m., the bell tolled, a singular mournful clang that jolted him from his sleep. He immediately rushed to the bell tower with several nuns, only to find the door still locked and the interior undisturbed. Father Antoine reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread during the incident, an impression of profound sadness that settled upon him like a shroud. He noted that the air around the tower felt perceptibly colder than the rest of the convent, even in the depths of winter. Tolling of the bell began to coincide with other subtle disturbances. Objects within the convent would occasionally move from their usual places. A missal might be found open to a random page on the altar when it had been left closed in the sacristy. A basket of bread left in the refectory was once found overturned, its contents scattered, though no one had been in the room. These incidents were always minor, but they contributed to the growing sense of an unseen presence within the abbey. The sisters began to associate the bell with a particular event that had occurred decades prior. In 1385, a young novice named Sister Marguerite, known for her exceptional singing voice and her devout spirit, had tragically died within the convent walls. She had been found in the bell tower itself, having fallen from the narrow winding stairs while ascending to light the lantern during a sudden illness. Her death was ruled an accident, but some whispered of a more profound grief that had led her to such a precarious climb in her weakened state. Sister Marguerite had loved the great bell, often referring to it as the voice of God. The ringing of the bell continued for nearly a year. It seemed to fade during the warmer months, only to return with renewed vigor as winter approached. It was never explained. No human hand was ever found to have touched the rope. No natural cause was ever identified. The sisters of St. Helena learned to live with the unbidden voice of their great bell, a constant chilling reminder of an unseen presence, perhaps a lingering spirit tied to the very heart of their sacred space. Convent's internal ledger, meticulously kept for financial and historical purposes, specifically the Ridsturum Abbatiae, Sanctae, Helenae de Amaro Radis, recorded entries from the year 1421 to 1422, noting campana sponte pulsata, or the bell rung by itself, and the profound spiritual unease it caused the community. The account ends without offering any conclusion as to the source or meaning of the mysterious tolls. Number 8. The shadow in the choir stalls. The ancient Cistercian convent of Clairefontaine, situated in a remote, heavily wooded valley in Picardy, France, had stood for over 2 centuries by the year of our Lord 1278. Its reputation was one of austere piety and rigorous observance. However, a profound disruption began to manifest within the very heart of the convent's spiritual life, the choir. During the lengthy daily offices, specifically Compline, the final prayer service of the day, a dark, shifting shadow began to appear among the sisters in the choir stalls. Sister Catherine, a young novice with a keen eye and a naturally observant disposition, was the first to notice it. As the nuns chanted the psalms in the dim light of the oil lamps, casting long, wavering shadows across the stone walls, Sister Catherine perceived a faint movement in the peripheral vision of her left eye. It was not a sister moving, nor was it the play of light. It was a deeper shade of darkness, a formless patch of gloom that seemed to materialize within the row of empty choir stalls directly opposite her. Stalls usually reserved for visiting dignitaries or the abbess's personal attendants was fleeting, visible only for a moment before it receded into the deeper shadows of the carved wood. She dismissed it as a trick of the light, a consequence of her long hours of prayer. Yet, the shadow returned the following evening, and the evening after that. It was always during Compline, always in the same section of the choir. It began to take on a more defined, though still indistinct shape. It was not a human figure, but rather a swirling, eddying mass of black, like smoke without fire or ink spilled into water. It seemed to pulse faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if it possessed some inner energy. Sister Agnes, a venerable nun who had served as sacristan for over 40 years, also began to report similar observations. She described it as a feeling of cold despair emanating from the area where the shadow appeared. She mentioned that the very air in that section of the choir felt heavy, as if the oxygen had been partially removed. The phenomena escalated when the shadow began to move. It would drift silently from one empty stall to another, sometimes seeming to expand to fill the entire space, then contract to a mere wisp. The sisters found themselves subtly, unconsciously shifting their gaze towards the empty stalls, their concentration broken by the eerie presence. Chanting would falter, and a tangible anxiety would descend upon the chapel. Abbess Eleanor, a woman of unyielding faith, initially admonished the sisters for their lack of focus, attributing their fear to overactive imaginations or perhaps insufficient spiritual discipline. However, she too began to feel the chilling presence. During Compline, she felt a distinct, icy breath on the back of her neck. Despite the complete stillness of the air within the chapel, she turned her head slightly and swore she saw the shadow writhe and swell directly behind the empty stall where the breath had seemed to come from. The shadow never directly interfered with the sisters, nor did it make any audible sounds. Its presence was purely visual, a profound disturbance in the very light of the chapel, and an overwhelming sense of dread it instilled. The oil lamps, usually steady, would sometimes flicker violently when the shadow was most active, casting the chapel into momentary near darkness before regaining their glow. The stained glass window above the altar depicting the Virgin Mary seemed to grow unusually dim during these periods, as if an invisible veil had been drawn over it. One evening during Compline, Sister Mathilde, a young novice prone to vivid spiritual experiences, fainted outright. When she revived, she spoke of feeling an overwhelming sorrow, a profound despair that pressed in on her from all sides. She claimed that as she lost consciousness, She saw a pair of deep, hollow eyes, filled with an ancient, unbearable grief, staring out from the center of the shifting darkness. These eyes, she said, were not malevolent, but infinitely sad, as if they had witnessed an eternity of suffering. She further elaborated that the coldness emanating from the shadow was not just physical, but a spiritual chill, a presence of profound desolation. Prior Father Lewis, a local cleric brought in to offer spiritual guidance, was deeply troubled by the accounts. He spent several nights observing Compline, sitting quietly in the back of the chapel. He confirmed the inexplicable fluctuations in the lamplight and the tangible atmosphere of unease. While he never claimed to see a distinct shape, he reported feeling an overwhelming sense of oppression, as if the air itself was too heavy to breathe. He noted that the incense, usually a comforting and purifying scent, seemed to grow acrid and unpleasant during these evening services. The sisters began to hypothesize about the origin of the shadow. Some whispered of a sister who had died in despair, perhaps a nun who had been forced into the convent against her will and never found peace. Others speculated about a forgotten tragedy, a hidden sin within the convent's history. One particular rumor, whispered in hushed tones, concerned Sister Philippa, a nun who had lived in the convent over a century prior. She was said to have been an exceptionally beautiful woman who had entered the convent to escape a forced marriage to a cruel lord. She had taken her vows with great reluctance and was said to have spent her entire life within the convent walls in a state of profound melancholy, never finding true peace and dying in isolation in the infirmary. Her cell, it was noted, was adjacent to the choir stalls, where the shadow most frequently appeared. The shadow in the choir stalls became a regular though terrifying part of life at Clairefontaine. It never left the confines of the choir during Compline. It never spoke, it never touched. It was simply there, a silent, sorrowful presence, a blot upon the sacred space. No exorcism or blessing ever fully banished. It would recede for a few days, only to return a chilling testament to an unexplained presence tied to the very act of worship. Chronicon Monasterii Clarifontes, the official chronicle of Clairefontaine, recorded the events of 1278 as umbra in choro apparuit, or a shadow appeared in the choir, detailing the fear and spiritual disturbance it caused the sisters without offering any ultimate explanation for its persistent and silent manifestation. Number 7. The Unseen Knocker of St. Agnes. In the bustling city of Bruges, a hub of commerce and piety, stood the Augustinian convent of St. Agnes, established in the late 13th century. By the year 1405, this convent, renowned for its illuminated manuscripts and its charitable works among the poor, began to experience a peculiar and persistent disturbance, an unseen hand knocking upon the cell doors of the sisters, especially during the deepest hours of the night. The initial incident was reported by Sister Johanna, the convent's infirmarian, a woman known for her calm demeanor and her practical approach to life. One cold winter night, as the convent slept in a profound silence broken only by the occasional creak of timbers, Sister Johanna was jolted awake by a distinct, sharp rapping on her cell door. It was not a hesitant knock, but a firm, deliberate series of 3 rapid knocks, followed by a brief pause, then 3 more. She immediately assumed it was one of the sisters requiring aid, perhaps a sudden illness in the night. She called out, "Who is there?" But there was no reply. She rose from her cot, lit her small lamp, and opened her door. The corridor was empty, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the high windows. The air was still and cold. She checked the doors of the neighboring cells, but all were securely shut. She dismissed it as a dream, perhaps a residual sound from the heavy snowfall that had fallen earlier in the evening. However, the knocking recurred the very next night, and this time it was heard by Sister Clara, a young nun known for her piety and her truthful nature, whose cell was on the opposite side of the cloister. She described the exact same pattern. 3 firm knocks, a pause, then 3 more. Like Sister Johanna, she found no one when she opened her door. The experience unsettled her deeply. Soon, the unseen knocker became a nightly phenomenon. It never focused on a single cell, but seemed to move throughout the convent, striking doors in various sections of the building. The sound was always consistent, crisp, clear, and undeniably produced by something striking wood. Sometimes the knocking would follow a sister as she walked down a corridor at night, stopping just outside her door as she entered her cell, then resuming the moment she closed it. Sister Hildegard, the convent's mistress of novices, reported that the knocking often coincided with a sudden, inexplicable gust of cold wind that would sweep through the seemingly sealed corridors, causing the small oil lamps she carried to flicker wildly. The sisters, initially perplexed, grew increasingly fearful. They were accustomed to the quiet routine of convent life, and this unseen, persistent intrusion was deeply unsettling. Abbess Marie, a woman of profound spiritual strength, ordered investigations. The sisters inspected every door for loose panels or structural weaknesses. They even tried securing bells to the outside of the doors, hoping to catch the culprit if it was a prank. But the knocking persisted, always on the solid wood, always with the same rhythmic insistence, and never, ever was a visible source found. The bells remained silent, untouched. The sound itself began to change subtly. While always 3 knocks, it seemed to carry a different emotional weight, depending on the location. In the infirmary, it was often accompanied by a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, as if someone was in pain. In the scriptorium, where the sisters meticulously copied and illuminated texts, the knocking often sounded more urgent, almost demanding. Sister Felicia, a gifted artist who often worked late into the night on her illuminations, reported that the knocking sometimes seemed to move with her, following her around the room, always just out of her direct sight. She claimed that the very quills she used would vibrate faintly in her hand during these occurrences. One particularly disturbing incident involved the cell of Sister Gertrude, an elderly nun who had recently succumbed to a long illness and passed away. Her cell had been sealed, awaiting cleansing and redistribution. For several nights after her passing, the knocking was heard exclusively on her sealed door. Sister Veronica, whose cell was adjacent, reported hearing not only the distinct knocks, but also a faint, mournful moan emanating from within Sister Gertrude's unoccupied cell, a sound that she swore was filled with an unbearable longing. When the door was eventually unsealed for cleansing, the cell was found undisturbed, but the air within it was described as unnaturally heavy and cold, even for a room that had been sealed for days. The sisters, through hushed discussions and cautious observation, began to piece together a possible explanation. Decades prior, a young woman named Elizabeth had sought to enter the convent of St. Agnes, but her family had forbidden it, wishing her to marry a wealthy merchant. Elizabeth had been devout, yearning for a life of prayer and service. She had secretly corresponded with the abbess, begging for entrance, and had even tried to flee her family to reach the convent. However, she was always intercepted and brought back. Elizabeth, heartbroken, fell gravely ill and died, it was whispered, of a broken heart. She had always expressed a profound desire to knock on the convent's door as a true sister. Her dying wish, according to old oral traditions within the convent, was to be buried in the convent grounds. But her family refused, interring her instead in the family plot outside the city walls. The knocking continued, sometimes fading for a few nights, only to return with renewed vigor. It was a constant reminder of an unseen presence, a persistent plea that seemed to echo through the cold stone corridors. No amount of blessing or prayer seemed to fully appease the unseen knocker. The Sisters of St. Agnes learned to live with the nightly visitor, a spectral hand that sought admittance to a life it had never known. the Restreperum Capituli Sanctae Agnatus, the daily record of the convent's chapter meetings from the years 1405 to 1406, contains repeated entries detailing the pulsationes inexplicables, or unexplained disturbance they caused among the sisters, concluding each entry without offering a definitive explanation for the phenomena. Number 6. The Weeping Novice of St. Walpurga. Ancient Benedictine Abbey of St. Walpurga, situated on a secluded hillside overlooking the Tauber Valley in Germany, was a place of profound solitude and ancient tradition dating back to the 11th century. By the early 15th century, specifically the year 1433, a deeply unsettling phenomenon began to occur within its solemn walls. The sound of a young girl weeping, often accompanied by the distinct impression of a fleeting, childlike figure, particularly in the convent's dormitory and infirmary. The first to experience it was Sister Brigitta, the novice mistress, a compassionate but firm woman responsible for the spiritual formation of the young women entering the convent. One night, as she made her rounds through the dormitory, checking on the sleeping novices, she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sniffle, followed by a faint, trembling sob. It was the sound of a child weeping, a sound that sent an immediate pang of concern through her. She paused, listening intently. The sound seemed to emanate from the vicinity of the newest novice, a frail girl named Alara, who had only recently joined the community. Sister Brigitta approached Alara's cot, but the young novice was sleeping soundly, her breathing even. The weeping, however, continued, seeming to move subtly away from the cot towards the far wall of the dormitory. Sister Brigitta scanned the dimly lit room, but saw nothing amiss. The other novices were all asleep. She dismissed it as fatigue, or perhaps a dream of her own. Yet, the weeping returned the following night, and this time it was heard by several novices. Sister Anneliese, a timid girl, woke in the middle of the night to the distinct sound of a child crying from the corner of the dormitory, a soft, mournful sound that filled the silent room. She then perceived a flicker of movement near the dormitory entrance, a small, indistinct shape that seemed to dart away as she tried to focus on it. The shape was too swift, too translucent to be fully discerned. It was described as a fleeting, almost transparent figure, roughly the size of a small child, moving with an unnerving silence. The weeping began to manifest in other parts of the convent. It was heard frequently in the infirmary, a quiet, melancholic cry that often seemed to hover over the beds of ailing sisters, particularly those who were gravely ill. Sister Gertrude, a seasoned infirmarian, reported that the sound of the weeping would sometimes intensify dramatically when a sister was very close to death, as if mourning was occurring even before the final breath was drawn. She claimed that during these periods, the air in the infirmary would become impossibly cold, and the small perpetual lamp by the crucifix would dim significantly, almost to extinction. The abbess, Mother Hildegard, initially attributed the sounds to the wind or the settling of the old building. The weeping was too distinct, too human in its expression. It was never loud, never disruptive, but always present, a constant, sorrowful undertone to the convent's silence. The weeping was never accompanied by visible tears, but the sound itself conveyed a profound sadness. The sisters began to feel the presence of the weeping novice more strongly. Some reported feeling a light, almost imperceptible touch on their habits as they walked through the dormitory at night, or a gentle tug on their rosary beads. Sister Isolde, a young nun responsible for cleaning the infirmary, recounted an incident where a small carved wooden doll usually kept on a shelf was found cradled in the arms of a statue of the Virgin Mary, though no one had been in the room since it was cleaned. She swore she heard a soft, almost inaudible giggle immediately after discovering the doll. The origin of the weeping novice was a topic of hushed discussion. Convent's oral history contained a tragic tale from the late 13th century. A young girl, barely 7 years old, named Liesel, had been sent to the convent during a terrible plague that swept through the region, decimating her family. She was meant to be raised within the convent walls, destined to become a nun when she came of age. However, Liesl herself contracted the plague shortly after her arrival. She died in the infirmary, alone, her parents having already perished. It was said that Liesl had been terrified of being separated from her family, and had wept incessantly during her short time in the convent, longing for her mother. Her cries were said to have ceased only upon her last breath. Some believed that the weeping was a lingering echo of Liesl's profound sorrow, unable to find peace even in death. The weeping novice, as the sisters came to call the unseen presence, became a part of the convent's unique atmosphere. She never caused harm, never manifested with malevolence. Her presence was one of profound sadness and childlike longing. She was a constant, gentle reminder of a life lost too soon, a sorrow that lingered within the sacred space. No prayers or blessings seemed to dispel her. She was simply there, a silent, sorrowful companion to the sisters, a testament to an unspoken grief that permeated the very stones of St. Walpurga. The Annals Monasterii Sanctae Walpurgae, the convent's meticulously kept historical records, includes entries from the year 1433 detailing lamentatio puerilis, auditae, or childish lamentation heard, and the various locations where the weeping of explanation for the persistent spectral cries. Number 5. The Phantom Procession of Fulda. In the ancient imperial abbey of Fulda, a renowned Benedictine monastery in Germany, one of the most prominent centers of learning and spirituality in the Holy Roman Empire, a perplexing series of events began to unfold in the year 1187. While Fulda was a monastery for monks, it also housed a small secluded guest house and infirmary, managed by a small community of Benedictine oblates, women who dedicated their lives to service without taking formal vows, living in a separate annex. It was within this annex, particularly in the chapel attached to it, that a phantom procession began to appear. The first reports came from Sister Adelheid, a respected oblate known for her meticulous care of the sick. She was assisting an ailing pilgrim in the infirmary one moonlit evening when she distinctly heard the faint sounds of chanting emanating from the small chapel connected to their annex. It was a Gregorian chant, familiar to her, but it seemed muffled and distant, as if coming from behind a heavy wall. She assumed a group of monks from the main abbey had mistakenly entered their chapel for an unscheduled prayer. However, when she peered through the crack of the chapel door, she saw no one. Yet the chanting continued, growing slightly louder, accompanied now by the faint rustle of robes and the soft shuffle of many feet on stone. Sister Adelheid, curious and slightly unnerved, pushed the door open fully. The chapel was empty. The altars were bare, the rows of humble wooden benches deserted, yet the sounds persisted, seeming to emanate from the very air within the small, sacred space. She felt a profound coldness settle upon her, a chill that seemed to penetrate her very bones despite the relative warmth of the infirmary. The chanting, a mournful Kyrie eleison, filled the small chapel, creating an atmosphere of deep solemnity, almost sorrow. Over the following weeks, the phantom procession became a recurring phenomenon. It always occurred after Compline, usually between midnight and the early hours of dawn. The sounds were consistent, the soft rhythmic tread of many footsteps, the rustle of monastic robes, and the low resonant chanting. Sometimes the chanting would be clear enough to distinguish Latin phrases, particularly those associated with burial rites or prayers for the dead. The sounds were always accompanied by a distinct and pervasive chill, a cold that permeated the walls and floor of the chapel, making the very air feel heavy and still. The most disturbing aspect was the visual manifestation. While never fully distinct, witnesses began to report fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures moving through the chapel. Sister Gisela, a young oblate known for her steady nerves, recounted how, during one particularly active manifestation, she peered into the chapel through a small spy hole in the sacristy door. She saw not clear figures, but rather tall, dark forms, like columns of solidified shadow, gliding silently through the rows of benches, seemingly following the path of a traditional monastic procession. They were always too indistinct to discern faces or specific features, but their movements were slow, deliberate, and undeniably purposeful. They appeared to move towards the altar, then turn and process back out of the chapel, fading into the shadows of the corridor. The phenomenon caused considerable disquiet among the oblates. They were devout women, but the constant, unexplained presence of this spectral procession began to erode their peace. Abbess Scholastica, a woman of deep faith and practical administrative skills, sought counsel from the abbot of the main monastery, Abbot Rabanus, a scholar and theologian. Abbot Rabanus, accompanied by several monks, conducted a thorough inspection of the chapel and the surrounding annex. They found no hidden passages, no natural causes for the sounds. During their observation period, Abbot Rabanus himself heard the faint chanting and felt the chilling cold. He described it as a deeply spiritual sound, yet utterly disembodied, and noted that the air itself felt heavy-laden with an invisible presence. The oblates began to research the chapel's history. Old records and local oral traditions hinted at a forgotten tragedy. It was said that in the late 11th century, during a particularly virulent epidemic, a small group of pilgrims, including several women, had sought refuge and care in the then nascent guest house and infirmary. Many of them succumbed to the illness and were buried quickly in an unmarked plot near the chapel, as fear of contagion prevented proper lengthy burial rites. It was whispered that these unfortunates, deprived of full rites and a proper procession to their final resting place, now reenacted their spiritual journey within the chapel. One particularly persistent rumor spoke of a young female pilgrim, a devout woman who had died longing for a full and proper Christian burial procession. Unable to have her last rites fulfilled in a place of her own choosing, the phantom procession continued for several years. It never caused physical harm, never disrupted the material world in a tangible way beyond the sounds and the chilling cold. It was a silent, sorrowful echo of a past tragedy, a ritual unfulfilled, perpetually replayed by unseen entities. The sisters and oblates of Fulda learned to live with the nightly visitors, a somber reminder of history lingering within their walls. The Annals Fuldenses Continuatio, the continuous chronicle of the Abbey of Fulda, written by various monastic scribes throughout the medieval period, containing entries from the years 1187 to 1190. Detailing of shadows observed in the female annex chapel, meticulously recording the audible and palpable sensations experienced by the oblates, without offering any definitive conclusion as to their origin or meaning. Number 4. The Raven of Rivolz. The Cistercian Abbey of Rivolz, a magnificent monastic complex nestled in a secluded valley in North Yorkshire, England, was a thriving center of spiritual life and agricultural innovation in the mid-12th century. However, in the year 1165, a series of increasingly disturbing events began to unfold, centered around the constant ominous presence of a large, unnaturally silent raven, which seemed to portend illness and death among the sisters of the small attached nunnery dedicated to St. Mary Magdalene. The first incident was reported by Sister Alara, who was tending to the convent's medicinal herb garden. She noticed a raven perched on the high wall of the convent's infirmary wing. This was not unusual, as ravens were common in the area, but this particular bird was unnervingly still, its black eyes fixed intently on the infirmary window. It did not caw or move. Its stillness was profound. As Sister Alara watched, a sudden, violent shiver ran through her, and she felt an inexplicable sense of dread. Later that day, Sister Bertha, an elderly nun suffering from a chronic ailment, suddenly took a turn for the worse and passed away in the infirmary. Sister Elara immediately thought of the raven. The following week, the raven reappeared, this time perched on the roof of the refectory. It remained there for hours, its silence and stillness deeply unsettling to any sister who observed it. That evening, Sister Agatha, who had been in good health, collapsed during Compline and developed a rapid, fatal fever. The abbess Mother Isabella noted the coincidence with concern but dismissed it as mere superstition, yet the pattern continued with chilling regularity. Whenever a sister fell gravely ill or was nearing her death, the raven would appear. It always materialized, silently perching on a prominent spot near the ailing sister's location, the infirmary window, the roof of her cell, or even the branch of a tree outside the dormitory. It never made a sound, never moved, except for the slow, deliberate turn of its head, its dark eyes seeming to gaze with an unnerving intensity towards the afflicted sister. Its silence was its most terrifying quality. The absence of its usual harsh call made its presence even more ominous, as if it was a messenger of a silent, inevitable fate. The sisters, initially hesitant to speak of their fears, began to share their experiences. Sister Benedicta, who nursed the sick, spoke of the air growing impossibly cold in the infirmary whenever the raven was visible through the window, even in the height of summer. She claimed to feel a distinct pressure on her chest, as if something heavy was pressing down on her whenever the raven's gaze seemed to settle on the patient she was tending. The infirmary lamp, usually a steady beacon, would flicker erratically, sometimes dimming to a faint glow. The raven itself appeared unnaturally large, its feathers a deeper, more profound black than any other bird. Its movements, when it did move, were slow and deliberate, almost ponderous. It never flew away abruptly, but would vanish as silently and suddenly as it appeared, only to reappear when the next illness took hold. The bird seemed to possess an awareness, a malevolent intelligence in its unwavering gaze. The abbess, Mother Isabella, a woman of deep faith and strong will, organized a blessing of the convent, and the sisters prayed constantly for divine protection. But the raven persisted, became a living embodiment of the convent's mortality. A constant reminder of their fragile existence, the sisters learned to dread its silent appearance. Presence brought a profound sense of foreboding, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. One particularly poignant incident involved Sister Joanna, a young novice who had recently taken her vows. She developed a cough that quickly worsened. The raven appeared, perching directly above her cell window, its gaze seemingly fixed upon her. Sister Joanna, despite her fear, expressed a strange sense of resignation. She claimed that during the nights she could hear a faint, rhythmic tapping on her window pane, a sound that seemed to emanate from the raven itself, though no actual contact was made. She succumbed to her illness within days of the raven's appearance, joining the growing number of sisters who passed after its silent vigil. The sisters began to whisper about the origin of the raven. Some believed it was a manifestation of a vengeful spirit, perhaps a woman who had been wronged or neglected within the convent in centuries past. An old, unverified rumor, passed down through generations of local villagers, spoke of a young woman named Isolde, who had been sent to the Rieuvolgues nunnery in the early 12th century, not for piety, but as a punishment for a perceived transgression against a powerful family. Isolde, heartbroken and filled with a profound resentment, eventually wasted away and died in the infirmary, cursing the convent and its inhabitants with her dying breath. It was said that as she breathed her last, a large black raven had landed on the infirmary roof and had watched her pass with unnerving intensity. The Raven of Rieuvolgues became a somber legend within the convent walls. It continued its silent, chilling vigil for several years, its appearances always preceding a death or grave illness. It was a tangible, terrifying symbol of an unseen power, a chilling testament to a lingering, perhaps malevolent presence tied to the convent's very existence. No amount of prayer or blessing ever fully banished. The Liber Memorandorum Monasteri Sancti Maria Magdalenae de Riavolx, a collection of various administrative and anecdotal notes from the convent, records entries from the years 1165 to 1168, its uncanny association with death and sickness among the sisters, concluding each entry without offering any definitive ecning the sisters, concluding each entry, Munum Mundus Sisters. Number 3. The Shifting Shadows of Sponheim. In the secluded valleys of the Hunsrück region, within the ancient Benedictine convent of Sponheim, founded in the 12th century, a pervasive and unnerving phenomenon began to disturb the sisters in the year 1389. It was not a specific apparition nor a distinct sound, but rather a profound and unsettling manipulation of light and shadow within the convent's library, a vast and quiet space filled with priceless manuscripts and ancient tomes. The shadows themselves seemed to move, coalesce, and shift in ways that defied natural explanation. Sister Eleonora, the convent's diligent and highly respected librarian, was the first to experience the full extent of this disturbance. She spent countless hours in the library, meticulously cataloging and preserving the convent's extensive collection. One afternoon, as the late autumn sun streamed through the high-arched windows, casting predictable patterns of light and shadow across the rows of wooden shelves, Sister Eleonora noticed something profoundly wrong. The shadows, which should have been static and defined, seemed to shimmer and undulate. They coalesced in the corners of the room, growing denser and darker than any natural shadow could be. They seemed to possess a depth and almost three-dimensional quality, as if they were not merely an absence of light, but a physical presence. As Sister Eleonora watched, a particularly dense patch of shadow near a tall bookshelf seemed to stretch, elongating itself towards the ceiling, then contracted briefly, forming a shape that was vaguely humanoid, before dissolving back into the general gloom. She rubbed her eyes, convinced it was fatigue. The phenomena persisted, growing more frequent and more pronounced. The shifting shadows were always silent. They never made a sound, never moved an object. Their manifestation was purely visual, a profound distortion of perception within the library. The very light within the room seemed to struggle against them, as if the shadows were actively absorbing the illumination. Sister Ursula, a young novice assisting in the library, reported that the light from the oil lamps she carried sometimes seemed to dim or flicker when she passed certain areas where the shadows were particularly dense, as if an unseen barrier was blocking the light. The abbess, Mother Adeliza, a woman known for her keen intellect and her practical approach to convent life, initially attributed the reports to the dim lighting or the age of the sisters' eyes. However, when she spent an afternoon in the library observing the phenomena herself, she found herself profoundly disturbed. She noted that the shadows around the large central reading table seemed to writhe and flow, constantly changing their shape without any external cause. The light that penetrated the stained glass windows appeared distorted, almost bent in certain areas, as if the air itself was warped. The most unnerving aspect was the feeling of being watched. While the shadows never formed a distinct face or figure, their constant fluid movement conveyed an impression of unseen eyes, a pervasive presence observing the sisters. Sister Brigitte, a scribe working on an illuminated manuscript in the library, suddenly felt an intense cold on her right hand, despite the warmth of the roaring fire. She looked up to see a dense swirling mass of shadow directly behind her, seeming to hover just above her shoulder. It was too close and too defined to be an accidental shadow. She quickly moved, and the shadow dispersed, only to coalesce once more in the corner of the room. The sisters began to whisper about the origin of these disturbing shadows. The library, a repository of knowledge, also contained some of the convent's oldest and most mysterious artifacts. It was rumored that, deep within the restricted section, behind a locked grille, lay a collection of forbidden texts, brought to the convent centuries ago by a wandering scholar who had briefly sought refuge there. These texts were said to contain ancient knowledge, some of it of a dubious or even dangerous nature, and were sealed away by the abbess of the time to prevent their contents from corrupting the sisters. Oral tradition held that one of these texts, a grimoire of obscure symbols and unsettling diagrams, had caused a profound disturbance in the convent years ago, resulting in the sudden unexplained illness of several nuns and the mysterious disappearance of a novice. It was whispered that the powerful, unholy energies contained within these books had left a lingering imprint upon the very fabric of the library. The shifting shadows of Sponheim became a permanent, unsettling feature of the convent's library. They never directly harmed anyone, never made a sound, but their constant silent movement, their ability to warp light and evoke a pervasive sense of being watched, created an atmosphere of profound unease. No blessing, no amount of holy water seemed to disperse them. They were simply there, a silent, swirling testament to an unexplained presence tied to the very space of knowledge and ancient secrets. Codex Sponheimensis, a collection of various administrative and spiritual notes maintained by the abbesses of Sponheim, includes entries from the years 1389 to 1392, detailing umbrae mobiles, or moving shadows observed, within the convent library, noting the spiritual de sisters to provide a definitive of the sisters to provide a definitive as to sisters. Number 2. The Haunted Well of Wetterau. In the picturesque Test Valley of Hampshire, England, stood the ancient Benedictine Abbey of Wetterau, a formidable monastic institution founded in the 10th century and later rebuilt in the 12th. By the mid-13th century, specifically the year 1251, a chilling series of events began to unfold around the convent's main well, a deep, stone-lined structure that supplied the community with water. The well began to emanate strange, mournful sounds, and spectral figures were occasionally glimpsed near its mouth. Sister Philippa, the nun responsible for drawing water for the convent's daily needs, was the first to report the initial disturbance. One morning, as she lowered the heavy wooden bucket into the well, she heard a distinct guttural moan emanating from the depths, a sound so profound and filled with despair that it made her drop the rope. She peered into the dark shaft, but saw nothing but the reflection of the sky on the water's surface. The moan subsided, leaving her deeply unsettled. She dismissed it as a trick of the echo or perhaps a subterranean animal. However, the sounds intensified. Soon, other sisters heard the moans, often accompanied by faint splashes that suggested something was moving in the water far below, though the well was known to be sealed from any direct underground currents. Sister Margaret, a stout and no-nonsense nun, reported that when she drew water, the bucket would sometimes come up with an unnaturally cold film on its surface, and the water itself would feel oddly heavy, as if it contained more than just water. She also noted a faint, metallic tang in the water after these occurrences. The well's sounds escalated from moans to what sounded unmistakably like muffled cries for help, sometimes accompanied by a violent gurgling sound, as if someone was struggling for breath. These sounds were always faint, as if coming from a great distance, but they were undeniable. The convent's daily rhythm began to show the strain. The sisters grew hesitant to approach the well alone, especially after dusk. The most disturbing phenomena involved the visual manifestations. Several sisters reported seeing fleeting, indistinct figures near the well's mouth, particularly in the low light of dawn or dusk. Sister Isolde, a young novice, recounted a terrifying incident where she saw a swirling mist coalesce near the well, taking on the vague, shadowy form of a woman. The figure seemed to be struggling, its arms outstretched before it dissipated entirely, leaving behind an intense, chilling cold that made Sister Isolde's teeth chatter. The figure was always too indistinct to identify, but its distress was palpable. The abbess, Mother Constance, a woman of deep piety, ordered the well to be blessed repeatedly by the visiting chaplain. Father Thomas' exorcism rites were performed near its mouth. The sounds persisted, and the fleeting shadows continued to appear. Father Thomas himself, during one of his blessings, reported feeling a profound and overwhelming sense of suffocation emanating from the well's depths, a feeling so strong it made him gasp for air. He swore he heard a desperate, choked cry just beneath the surface of the water as he sprinkled holy water into it. The sisters began to delve into the convent's historical records and local folklore for answers. An unsettling tale, rarely spoken of, emerged from the convent's earliest days, specifically from the 11th century. Concerned a young woman named Lady Edith, a powerful noblewoman who had founded the convent. She had been forced to enter the monastic life after a scandal involving a forbidden love affair with a knight. Lady Edith was said to have been fiercely defiant, deeply unhappy within the convent walls, and harbored a profound resentment towards the strictures placed upon her. One moonless night, consumed by despair and longing for her former life, she reportedly attempted to flee the convent. She was intercepted by the convent guards, and in a desperate struggle she fell into the deep well, drowning before any aid could reach her. Her death was quickly hushed up, officially attributed to a sudden illness, and her body was recovered and secretly buried outside the convent walls. The well was believed to have been sealed for a time after the incident, only to be reopened decades later. The sounds and sights around the well of Wetterau continued a constant, chilling reminder of a past tragedy, and a spirit perhaps trapped in its watery grave. The moans of despair, the muffled cries, and the fleeting, struggling figures near the well mouth became an unshakable part of the convent's atmosphere. No amount of prayer or intervention ever fully silenced them. The Carcelarium Abbatiarum Wetterau, a collection of legal documents and notes pertaining to the Abbey of Wetterau, includes entries from the years 1251 to 1254, detailing voces aquae, or voices from the water, and vices pro putium, or sights near the well, retating of a stress they caused the community, with a persistent and haunting phenomena. Number 1. The possessed relic of Saint Odilia. In the secluded valleys of Alsace, France, atop a mountain known as Mont Saint-Odile, stood the ancient abbey of Saint Odilia, a renowned Benedictine convent founded in the 7th century, a place of pilgrimage and spiritual power. By the late 12th century, specifically the year 1198, a profound and terrifying disturbance began to plague the sisters, centering around a newly acquired relic. A bone fragment purported to be from Saint Ursula, brought to the convent for veneration. This relic, rather than bringing solace, seemed to be a conduit for a malevolent, unseen entity that began to exert a disturbing influence over the nuns. The relic, a small polished bone fragment encased in an ornate silver reliquary, was placed on a side altar in the convent's main chapel. Sister Gertrude, the convent's sacristan, was among the first to notice something amiss. As she prepared the altar for matins, she felt an intense, localized cold emanating directly from the reliquary, a cold that bit at her fingertips. She also noted a faint, almost metallic smell in the air around the relic, a scent that was both acrid and strangely sweet. Within days, subtle disturbances began to occur. The small lamp that burned perpetually before the reliquary would frequently extinguish itself without cause, only to relight moments later. The altar cloths, meticulously laid, would sometimes be found rumpled or shifted, as if an unseen hand had disturbed them. Sister Agnes, a devout nun, reported that, while praying before the relic, she felt a profound sense of spiritual oppression, as if a great weight was pressing down upon her soul, accompanied by a distinct feeling of a cold, unseen presence directly behind her. The phenomena escalated dramatically when some sisters began to experience physical manifestations. Sister Bertha, a young novice, was found one morning in her cell, her body contorted in an unnatural position, her eyes wide with terror. She spoke in a voice that was not her own, a guttural rasping sound that spoke of blasphemies and curses, shocking the devout community. This episode, occurring before several witnesses, lasted for several minutes before Sister Bertha collapsed into an exhausted sleep. When she awoke, she had no memory of the event. The possessions became more frequent, always affecting different sisters, though always when they had been near the reliquary. The possessed nuns would exhibit unnatural strength, speak in strange tongues, or utter venomous threats against the abbess and the sanctity of the convent. Their eyes would often roll back, or take on a terrifyingly empty stare. The air around them would grow impossibly cold, and a putrid smell would sometimes emanate from their persons. Sister Catherine, the convent's infirmarian, reported that the possessed nuns would often thrash violently, and sometimes small unseen scratches would appear on their skin after the episode, though no one had touched them. Abbess Roswitha, a woman of profound faith and immense resolve, recognized the gravity of the situation. She immediately contacted the Bishop of Strasbourg, a renowned exorcist, Father Emmerich. Father Emmerich arrived with a retinue of priests, prepared for a spiritual battle. He observed several possessions firsthand, noting the unholy strength of the affected sisters and the profound malevolence emanating from them. During one exorcism, the possessed nun, Sister Hildegard, levitated briefly above her cot, her voice echoing through the infirmary with a chilling, inhuman laugh that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Father Emmerich believed the entity was linked to the relic itself. He ordered the reliquary to be removed from the chapel. As the priests attempted to carry it, the reliquary seemed to resist, becoming impossibly heavy, vibrating intensely in their hands. They managed to place it in a consecrated chest in the depths of the abbey's crypt, hoping to contain the malevolent force. The possessions ceased almost immediately after the relic was removed, but a new terrifying phenomenon began. Crypt, a space usually reserved for the burial of abbesses and revered figures, began to resonate with terrifying sounds. The heavy stone slab over the crypt entrance would sometimes rattle violently, as if something was attempting to escape from within. Deep guttural growls and unearthly shrieks would emanate from the depths, audible throughout the entire convent, particularly during the silent hours of the night. The very earth around the crypt was reported to feel unusually warm to the touch, even in the depths of winter. Convent's oral tradition contained a disturbing tale from the 9th century. Powerful local sorcerer banished from the region for his dark practices was said to have hidden a cursed object within the foundations of the mountain itself, an object meant to defile any sacred space built upon it. It was whispered that the bone fragment in the reliquary had been found by monks in a hidden cave on the mountain before the convent was built, and that it was not truly a holy relic, but rather a fragment imbued with an ancient evil, perhaps a bone from the sorcerer himself, or an object he had consecrated to dark forces. This cursed object, it was said, was unearthed only to cause great spiritual strife. Possessed relic of Saint Odilia remained sealed within the crypt, its malevolent influence contained but never truly banished. The sounds from the crypt continued for years, a chilling reminder of the battle waged within the sacred walls. The spiritual attacks subsided, but the memory of the chilling possessions and the unholy entity remained a profound part of the convent's history, a testament to the dangers of unseen forces. The Annals Monasterii Sanctae Odilia, the continuous chronicle of the Abbey of Saint Odilia, records extensive entries from the years 1198 to 1202, detailing the demonum possessio, or demonic possession of the sisters, the involvement of Bishop Emmerich, and the subsequent sealing of the troublesome Evoca Malachite, always without offering any definitive evidence for the origin of the entity.